All right, welcome everyone to this week's Wednesday webinar. I'm Shannon Dill. This is the Mid-Atlantic Women in Agriculture sessions. We offer these the second and fourth Wednesday at noontime each month, and we have webinars scheduled through the end of December. We also, at the Blue Link, have a listing of our webinars as well as archived webinars where you can go to our YouTube channel and see all of the ones that we have listed. Before we get started, I would like to thank the sponsors and the collaborators of the Women in Ag program. They're great partners through this year-long program that we're able to offer. So thank you to them. With that, I'm going to turn today's session over to Dr. Haley Sater. We're really glad to have her here today and in Maryland. So she's fairly new to Maryland, and she's going to be talking to what you need to know to grow your own fruit. And I'm going to pass the ball to you, Haley, and you should be able to go ahead and open up your presentation.
All right. Can everybody see that? Looks like it.
Yes, it looks good.
Okay. Basically, thank you for the introduction, Shannon. I'm Haley Sater. I work down on the Lower Eastern Shore of Maryland in Wacomico County, but I'll be telling you about fruits that you can grow all across the Mid-Atlantic region. So we'll get started here. And so first, I just want to tell you about what I will be covering in this presentation and then what won't be covered. So this talk is really geared towards people who intend to be planting larger plots of fruit. So say at least an acre or something on the commercial side. I'll be covering what can be grown, or at least some of the more popular fruits that are grown here, and then advantages to fruit production, things you might want to consider before you decide to plant a whole orchard, and then really an overview of just some of the more popular fruits that are pictured in some of these on the slide. Okay, so what this talk is not really going to be covering is small home garden plantings of fruit. You may, for a home garden, it's just a completely different scale, so I won't be going over that. I'm not going to give you step-by-step instructions. How to manage an apple orchard, what to do in year 1, year 2, year 3. But I will give you resources to find that information. And then I won't be covering some of the less traditional systems like permaculture, which is where you grow lots of different fruits or lots of different plants in one system, or organic production. This is not that you can't do organic production, but I'm just not going to be talking about the specific requirements of those systems. Okay, so in the Mid-Atlantic region, we are kind of lucky because we can grow pretty much any of the temperate types of fruits. So what I'm talking about here are things that are not tropical, so you're not going to be growing mangoes or pineapples or bananas here, but you can really grow most of the fruits that we are used to seeing in the grocery store here. So what I'll be covering are strawberries, blueberries, blackberries, raspberries, apples, cherries, grapes, peaches, plums, and pears. And of course, there are more fruits. You can feel free to ask me about them, but I'm not going to be talking about less popular fruits like, say, cranberries or lingonberries or things of that nature. And then just because you can grow all of these fruits does not mean that it's easy to grow all of them. So orchard production especially can be very intensive. It can require a lot of specialized equipment. It can require a lot of chemical sprays to keep your fruit clean and insect free. So there are also a lot of types of these fruits, so say apples, grapes, or peaches that may not be right for this region. So just because you find a plant and it is a strawberry, that doesn't mean that it's right to be grown here. If it was bred in another region, like say Florida or California, it may not be a good fit for the mid-Atlantic. And in general, we like to say that anything that comes from California or that's bred in California and in a Mediterranean climate doesn't tend to do as well in this region. And the reason for that is because we have a lot more insect and pathogen pressure here on the East Coast than they have on the West Coast. So as a general rule of thumb, you don't bring any peaches or nectarines that are bred in California or strawberries over here unless you know that other people are growing them and that they've had success with them. If you're seriously considering establishing a fruit orchard, you may want to go visit somebody else who is growing fruit. So if the best way to learn about how to grow blueberries is to go to say a U-pick farm during season and see what they're doing, talk to the farmer. And what I've found in the fruit growing community is that most people are happy to share knowledge and information if you really are seriously interested in becoming a commercial grower, as long as you're not going to directly compete with their market. So, if you're going to set up a farm stand right next to them, they may not want to share. But I've found that most farmers around here do want to share their knowledge with their neighbors and people who are interested. So some of the advantages to growing fruit are, well, that you will have access to some of the best high quality fruit you've ever tasted. It's hard to really explain this unless you've had, I think most of us have had, a fresh strawberry that you pick out of the field. It's so much better than what you can get at a grocery store, and this applies to a lot of different fruits. And then, of course, fruit consumption in the US is on the rise. This is more true for some fruits than others. So, for example, so fresh fruit in general is going up. Peaches, however, are not trending upwards as much as something like berries. So the berry crops are very popular with consumers right now. And so I do like to advocate for them. And then fruit production is a way to diversify your farm. So if you already have a small farm operation, or if you grow vegetables or other agronomic crops, fruits are a way to add something to the mix that may have a completely different season, another revenue stream to help you diversify your risks. Other advantages to fruits, all of the fruit that I will be talking about in this presentation, all the fruits are perennial crops, or at least can be grown as perennial crops. They tend to have high market value. And then that means that you can sell fruit in a lot of different ways. So, for some people, wholesaling makes sense if you have a larger type farm, but you can also be fairly profitable by setting up your own farm stand on your farm. This will work better if you have, if you're in an area with high traffic, but you could also set up a CSA where people pay ahead and then you give them what you have each week or bi-weekly. You can go to local farmers markets. This tends to be a big moneymaker for fruit producers. So most of the orchards and other fruit producers that I've talked to, even though it's a lot of work to, man a farmer's market stand and load up all the fruit and drive there, that's where they make the bulk of their revenue, even if they only sell 30% of their product there and the rest they wholesale. But you can also run a U-pick operation too. And people love this. I think during the pandemic, U-Picks, you know, they were crazy. Everybody wanted to get outside. People remembered that they can go and pick their own food, and you know, that really rejuvenated the U-Pick market. So fruit are also versatile in the sense that you may want to be growing something like apples or grapes for the value-added products like wine or for cider. You can also make jellies and jams out of your product. You can sell pies. So there are lots of different ways to sell your product. And then, of course, farming fruit tends to be kind of lower impact and have lower nutrient requirements. So it's less intensive farming than something like yearly agronomic farming. Considerations. So these are things you definitely want to think about and plan for before you establish a whole orchard or fruit planting. So establishing costs per acre tend to be a lot higher for fruit than other types of crops. So there are tools online. I have an example of one here, and we can give you the link to this later if you would like it. It's a cost of production calculator from Penn State. And it actually, if you download it, you can put in different costs and really start to get an idea what your per acre basis is for your orchard. Another thing you need to consider is that some of these fruit crops take different amounts of time to produce. And so when is your return on investment? If you're going to grow something like strawberries, it's much more like a vegetable system where you plant the fruit in the summer or the fall, and then the next year you have a crop, so you have revenue. Whereas with tree fruit, you make that investment and it will be several years before you're recouping any cash. So these are the types of analyses and sort of budgeting that really is important to do before you start. Other things to consider if you have never grown fruit or vegetables, keep in mind that in the state of Maryland, we require what's called GAP certification or good agronomic practices. And so these are required for fruit and vegetable growers to make sure that they are meeting a state set of standards and to some degree national standards of basically safe and hygienic farming practices. So you have to keep workers safe. You have to keep the product safe so that we don't have outbreaks of foodborne illnesses. But this is another layer of I guess, to some extent bureaucracy, but another set of rules and standards that you need to consider if you're going to be starting a farm. Other things that you should be aware of, if you are in a region that already produces a lot of fruit, you may not have this trouble, but if you're in an area where most of the farms around you grow corn and soybeans or other agronomic crops, you may have trouble getting access to different equipment and chemicals you need, because the types of equipment and chemicals you need on a fruit farm are very different than what you need to grow most agronomic crops. So that's something that a lot of producers in my area, which is not really a huge fruit growing region, they tell me that they have some trouble with this, and they have to really find good suppliers and people that are willing to help them. Because if you're the only fruit grower, the co-op that you go to buy your supplies may not be as interested in helping you. So you've got to make sure that you have access to the tools you need. It can also be a little bit harder to find government support if you're growing specialty crops or fruits. So historically, there have been a lot of protections and different programs that commodity farmers, so people growing corn, soy, can access. These have been a little bit slower in coming to specialty crops, but there are some protections and programs that can help you, fund different projects on your farm at the state level and at the national level. You also want to consider that if you're planting any, at least 10 acres of any fruit, you are probably going to be needing seasonal labor. So this can be a problem for a lot of people. To find labor right now is very difficult. I see for hire signs everywhere. And so a lot of the fruit farms and orchards will bring in temporary agriculture workers on the H-2A program. And this program requires a lot of upfront paperwork, and you do have to have everything in advance. So it's not something you can do last minutely. So just be aware that programs like this exist to help you get labor, but they do require a lot of time and input. Okay, so how to actually make your orchard profitable. A lot of farms that I have been to and seen may have like a main crop. So, the crop that they really want to grow, maybe apples, but they may, and that's what they devote the bulk of their land to, but then they may have smaller patches of other fruits. So, some peaches in there and maybe some cherries and blueberries. And part of the reason to do this is, to have diversity, because if you have total crop failure in because of a storm or a late freeze for one fruit, you may be safe in another fruit that maybe flowers later. And so that's part of the reason to do this, but also if you're running a smaller operation or you have a U-pick, this can bring people in over a longer, more spread out season. So this tends to be the way that most fruit orchards operate here in Maryland. So other keys to success, you really want to know your crop. I know so many people who, plant now, learn it later, but it's really important to know all you can about a crop before you put it in to the ground. You want to use multiple varieties of whatever you're growing. So this will help protect you because it's another way to diversify the farm, but many of these crops or fruits require cross-pollination. And even if they don't require cross-pollination, if you get a disease, different varieties of fruit may have different levels of resistance to that disease. So it can help ensure that you don't have total crop failure, that you didn't plant all Honeycrisp apples and now the market for Honeycrisp apples is bad and they're all diseased and you lose everything. So you want to make sure that you map out your grounds before you plant. This is really important to think about because high and low ground can really make a difference in what you put in. Especially a lot of the berry crops have trouble if they're planted in low ground, which tends to stay wet or flooded. So just be aware of the geography of your farm and the soil differences around your farm. You want to make sure that you have the capacity to irrigate, so access to a well, and then know really like the capacity of that well, how much land it can realistically irrigate. And then of course, you will need access to cold storage, and generally you will need more cold storage than you think you will need. That's what most of the farmers I've talked to have said. Wow, we wish we'd built this bigger cooler first, but you know, you can always add on, but it's nice if you can just grow into that space. So I'm going to talk about the longevity of different fruit crops. So for most of the tree fruits like peaches, apples, cherries, pears, and plums, you're looking at least a 15-year planting, or up to, say, 40 years. And this will really depend on the orchard management. And then, you know, sometimes you may still have a productive crop, but it may not be economical to keep the fruit in the field, and sometimes people will replant earlier. Whereas with most of the smaller fruits, they don't tend to last in your field quite as long. Grapes, if they're managed well, they will stick around for quite a long time, whereas blueberries, 10 to 30 years would be an average for around here to keep a blueberry planting. That's really going to depend on whether you can keep that planting disease-free and well-managed. Blackberries and raspberries tend to be productive for 10 to 15 years. You can stretch them a little further if they're in good health, but usually not more than that. And then strawberries you won't keep in the field more than 3 years. People tend to only grow strawberries for 1 to 2 seasons. So much more like a vegetable crop. I'm going to just quickly go over grafting because this is something that you should understand before you plant any of the tree fruit. So most of the tree fruits that we grow will be grafted. What I mean by that is you have a genetically different plant on top than on bottom. So the rootstock is grown, and then a young scion, or the top of the plant, if you're growing a Honeycrisp apple, will be put on top of that rootstock. And the rootstock is used partially because well, it should have a strong root system, but also to help dwarf the plant. So most apples, peaches, and other fruit varieties will be on a rootstock. And then there are different levels of dwarfing that the rootstocks will provide. So some of the rootstocks for apples will really keep the tree much smaller, and this is easier to manage. So in an orchard, a lot of your labor costs will come from what you do in the winter when you're pruning. So the less you have to prune, the easier it is for you. And it's much easier to harvest from small trees. So apples, in the minute, we're going to go over crops now, and we'll start with apples. Apples around here tend to be grown on larger farms. I'm talking about like 50 acres plus. So part of the reason is just that historically we've been an apple growing area, but also you can store apples all year round. If you have 50 acres of apples, you could store a lot of that profit, or you could store a lot of that product throughout the year and then continue to sell it at the markets. However, apples tend to have a lower profit margin than a lot of other fruits, and it's a pretty competitive market because there are a lot of large growers, especially up in Pennsylvania and New York. There are some larger commercial apple orchards that you may end up competing against. So there are a whole bunch of new apple varieties. I'm not going to go over all of them, but what I can tell you is that because consumers are very aware, or tend to be aware of the different apple varieties, they may say want things like Honeycrisp or Evercrisp is a new one. Now there's going to be one on the market, Sweet Twist, or Wild Twist, sorry. And some of these varieties, you can't get them unless you buy into an apple club. And these clubs are basically exists to keep the variety from becoming overplanted, but it can be very expensive to purchase the membership. So unless you plan on planting a lot of that variety, it may not make sense to grow some of these new, really fantastically crunchy apples. So this is what I mean about the apple industry being a little bit more competitive than a lot of other fruits. Also, apples tend to be planted in high density nowadays. This everything I have looked at economic analysis wise, this tends to be the way to have the most productive orchard. You can see that these trees, they don't really look like trees. They kind of look like long straight poles, and they've got leaves on them and apples all the way up. And it's a more effective way to grow the fruit, and it's much easier to harvest from. One thing that's nice about apples and a lot of the other tree fruits is that they can be grown in areas where you have rocky soils or a slope. And so that's part of why they've been planted in the Appalachian Mountain region. And then apples do require cross-pollination, so you can't plant too large of a block of any one variety. If you're going to plant, you want to plant maybe two, maybe 3 rows of a single variety, and then you need to have a cross-pollinating variety. Because bees will only work a certain spatial region. A bee is not going to fly 1 mile to pollinate your apple. They're just going to do what's convenient for them. So one of the biggest diseases or challenges for apple growers that I'm going to mention is fire blight. This is a disease that basically every apple variety is susceptible to, but to different degrees. And if you plan to grow apples, you will hear a lot about fire blight, and you really will have to develop a program to protect your orchard against it. So now I'll talk a little bit about peaches and nectarines. They are really the same species. There is a single gene that controls whether or not a peach is a nectarine. And so nectarines just have 2 copies of a recessive allele, which is why they don't have the fuzz on the outside. So when I say peaches, I'm also including nectarines under that category. So peaches tend to be have a higher profit margin than apples. They don't actually require cross-pollination. They do require bees, but they don't require 2 varieties, the pollen from another variety to pollinate the flower of a variety. So that's one advantage. So you can kind of plant larger blocks. However, peaches kind of tend to be grown in these like on small trees that have this open type canopy that's spread out, but newer plantings, you start to see peaches in higher density. Now, I haven't seen all new plantings in high density, but this does seem to be the way of fruit growing of the future. So there are hundreds of peaches and nectarine varieties. Many of them, like I kind of mentioned before, if they are developed in California, may not be suitable to grow here in the mid-Atlantic. So this is something to look at. If you're going to plant peaches and nectarines, make sure that it's something that will grow well here and won't have too many disease issues. There are a lot of different fruit characteristics that you should consider when planting and choosing varieties. So these tend to be really important to consumers. So white and yellow flesh type, white flesh peaches tend to be a little bit sweeter. Yellow peaches tend to have a little bit more acid. The melting and non-melting flesh texture. Melting peaches are really what we call those traditional juicy, soft peaches, whereas the non-melting peaches have more of the flesh texture of an apple. They're crunchy, they don't really soften. And personally, I like the non-melting, but a lot of customers who've grown up eating peaches, they don't like this trait. So you have customers that want one or the other. They can have a cling stone or a free stone. So, the stone can adhere to the flesh or it can just kind of be loose. And then acid and subacid. So some peaches have that tart bite to them, and then a lot of the white peaches, but some of the yellow peaches are really just sweet and have very little acid, which is popular with certain consumer groups or some ethnicities. And then nowadays you have round peaches, or like the more traditional globe-shaped peaches, and then you have these new donut peaches, which are very popular. There aren't as many varieties of them, but they seem to do well in farmers markets. Personally, I don't like them any better than a normal peach, but because they're new and they're different, they are very popular. So the biggest grower challenge for peaches is by far bacterial spot. So this is a disease that is going to crop up pretty much every year, and it's part of the reason I mentioned that don't grow something from California here in the mid-Atlantic unless you know it's going to do well here, because this tends to be a problem that people in California don't have, and so they don't screen for this disease. And a lot of the varieties that are released out of their breeding programs don't really work very well here unless you want to have black spotty peaches. Oh, and I will say that different peach and nectarine varieties have different levels of resistance to this disease. So you want to pick some that have relatively high levels of resistance to bacterial spot. Okay, so pears I'm not going to spend as much time on. They tend to be similar to apples. They're very closely related. And so they also get the disease fire blight that I talked about. So you have to make sure that you plan to manage that. When you plant, there are a few varieties. There are far fewer varieties of pears than there are apples to choose from. So, I mean, the more traditional ones would be like a Bartlett pear, which is a European type. But you can also grow Asian pears, which are shaped and really have more of an apple type texture. And those tend to be popular among different consumers, specifically among Asian consumers. So if you're marketing if you're trying to choose, a specialty demographic to market your product to, that may be something to consider. Plums. So there are wild plums that are native to the US, but the two species of plums that are generally grown commercially here are either the Japanese type plums, and those ripen earlier, so they're like the summer plums. If you are at the farmer's market and you're buying plums right now, those are probably Japanese cultivars or varieties, and then they tend to have softer texture. They tend to be more sour. I don't really like them as much, but if you want to be in that market window of having early plums, then you're going to need to grow those varieties. Whereas there are European type plums, and those ripen more towards the fall, closer to like the apple season. They tend to be a little bit sweeter and have firmer texture. So for me, those are the plums I prefer, but both can be grown in this region. And then the cultivation of these of a plum orchard tends to be similar to peaches. And then I'll talk about cherries next, which are actually very similar to plums. So with cherries, they kind of break down into the two groups. You have sour cherries, which are generally for processing. However, there are certain demographics or people that like to make products out of tart cherries. They may be making jellies or liquor. So there are certain groups of people that really want to have tart cherries, but for the most part, people don't eat sour or tart cherries. But these varieties are self-fertile, so they still need pollination, but you can plant larger blocks of a single variety. Whereas sweet cherries tend to do better in the fresh market. You get fairly high prices for cherries. Of course, they require a lot of labor to pick, but they also tend to be an early fruit. They're before your peaches are even ready, so they're a good thing to also have on your farm, but they do require cross-pollination. They are closely related to plums, like I said before, and unfortunately, they're a highly perishable fruit. So if you're going to have cherries, you need to be able to move them to market fairly quickly because they don't store very well. This is also true for peaches. These types of fruits, you really need to have a market to move that product so that you don't have too much all at once. So grapes, there are many different kinds of grapes that you can grow here in the Mid-Atlantic. And so I've broken them up into kind of 4 groups. You can grow wine grapes, which are Vitis vinifera. And most of the wine grapes that you would be growing here would not be things like the Pinot Grigio or Cabernets. They would be grapes that are developed specifically for this region, for the Mid-Atlantic, because again, things that do well in the Mediterranean, like in the south of France, may not be the best suited for the Mid-Atlantic. But we do have plenty of wine grapes that you grow here. You can also grow table grapes, so these tend to be very popular with consumers. Because they have really great flavor. So if anybody is interested, I really recommend growing your own table grapes because they are so much better than what you get at the store. You can also grow Concord or Labrusca grapes. Those are native to the US, and that tends to be what is used in grape jelly. You can also grow what are called muscadine grapes. And these are another species of grapes, and they are a little bit different from the other 3. They tend to kind of be for specialty markets. They're grown a lot more in the southern regions of the US where they have trouble growing these other types of grapes, but you can grow them. They do look like these. They're very round with thick skins. And they have a very unique and kind of interesting flavor. So I like them, but I think that table grapes taste a little bit better. Muscadines also have seeds. So many grapes are self-fertile. They do still require pollination, but this is kind of one advantage of grapes. And then locally, at least here in Maryland, there has been high demand for grapes from winemakers because there are all these new wineries popping up and not enough grapes being produced in the state to supply them. So right now, at least, the grape market for wine grapes is very hot. With grapes, grapes are grown on trellises. This is the most commercially feasible way to grow them. They tend to be grown in a way that you have the leaves on the top of the trellis and the grapes as a bunch on the bottom so that it's easier to pick them. But there are different ways to train the grapes or prune them so that they grow the way you want them to. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time on blueberries and some of the berries because These are my favorite fruits, and it's kind of what I have more of a background in. I just love blueberries. I think it's really cool that they are a native plant. The northern highbush blueberry is native to this region and specifically New Jersey. They like soils with high organic matter. So this is really important to keep in mind because if you own a patch of land like in Western Maryland that is all rocks, that's not really an ideal environment for blueberries. So you need to have a well-drained soil, but it needs to also have this organic matter. So a sandy loam is best. If you have pure sand like what I have in my front yard, you need to add some organic matter. If you have something like clay or rocks, this is also not ideal. Clay will hold way too much moisture, and blueberries, even more than a lot of the other fruit, will pretty much they will die back if they are sitting in water. So you can actually plant them on raised beds, so you can kind of fill up the row before you plant them if you think that drainage is going to be an issue. Another thing I have to mention about blueberries, because it's very different than most of the other crops that I've talked about, they like a very low pH. So 4.5 to 5 is really ideal for blueberries. Most of these other plants I've been talking about are more in the range of 6 to 7, which is more of what would be a normal pH for most crops. So if your soil pH is too high, you need to add something to bring it down before you plant blueberries. So we just prepared an area on one of our research farms for blueberries, and we had to apply this inorganic sulfur, and sulfur, well, it doesn't smell great, so that was a big mess to apply. But yeah, you have to make sure that you get this pH right, or you will start to see all kinds of nutrient deficiencies and problems in your blueberry planting right away. Then if you want to add organic matter that will also help lower pH, you can use things like pine needles, pine bark, and peat moss. Blueberries do require cross-pollination, which means you need to be planting 2 different varieties close to one another so that bees can bring pollen from one variety to the other for good fruit set. You will have fruit in June and July, so this could be nice if you want something kind of early in the season, and then maybe you want to have your peaches later and then apples. You can have a small planting of berries, but you need to think about things like bird netting. If you have like only 1 acre of blueberries planted, you can have your entire crop decimated by birds. So this is really something to think about if you're only going to be putting in a small area. And there are different ways to throw bird netting over a planting, or different ways to deal with birds. You can have a recording play loud hawk sounds, but really the most effective way that I've seen to keep birds out of a blueberry planting is with bird net. There are different types of blueberries that you may see for sale if you are looking to buy blueberries. What I would recommend for this region are northern highbush blueberries. Or high chill varieties of blueberries. And that's because the southern highbush blueberries, they have a lower requirement for the number of cold hours that they need in a season to tell them to make flowers. So what'll happen a lot of times here in the mid-Atlantic, we'll have a stretch of cold, and then we'll have some warm weather in February. And then the southern highbush blueberries would think, okay, it's time to flower. I've gotten enough cold time. They make flowers, and then it gets cold again, and then the fruit gets frozen off. So that can be, that's why I don't recommend planting southern highbush varieties here. And then rabbit-eye blueberries can also be grown here in the Mid-Atlantic. They're very popular in Georgia. They're a little bit easier to grow in general than northern highbush, but the fruit quality tends to be lower. They have thicker skins. They kind of have a poorer flavor. So I don't recommend planting rabbit eyes either, but you will see them for sale. Blackberries and raspberries I have combined because both blackberries and raspberries belong to the genus Rubus, and they have very similar life cycles. They grow on biannual canes, so that means they send up a cane or a stalk the first year, and then the second that cane survives for a second year. And both blackberries and raspberries are native to the U.S. The cultivated raspberries that we grow actually have some European, they're also European raspberries, so they have a mixture of that. But most of the blackberries that we grow here in the US are basically from here, native to this region genetically. So as far as blackberries and raspberries life cycle, I want to explain this first year, second year cane process. So for the most part, in the first year, the blackberries and raspberries will send up these first year canes. These canes will not produce fruit, they'll just grow vegetatively, and we call that the primocane. Now there are some new varieties of blackberries and raspberries that are primocane fruiting varieties, and those will make fruit towards the end of the first season on that first year primocane. Now, the floricane is what you call the second year cane, and the floricanes will bear flowers and produce fruit in the summer. So even if you have a primocane fruiting variety, you can leave that cane a second year and it will still produce more flowers on that same cane, and then you'll have summer fruit. So this is something to understand, and it's some lingo that you'll need to know if you're trying to purchase raspberries or blackberries. They may say primocane fruiting, so that's the difference. Most varieties and most of the older varieties are floricane fruiting, but there are some new blackberries and raspberries that have this primocane fruiting trait. So I advocate that anyone for their own health and safety, or if you're going to do a U-pick, you should definitely plant thornless varieties. This is especially true for blackberries. I think the new thornless varieties of blackberries have way better fruit quality than the old ones, so there's really no excuse for not planting a thornless variety. With raspberries, this is a little less true. There aren't as many thornless varieties available, but I kind of tend to think that blackberries have way worse thorns to deal with. So these are some of the cultivars here of blackberries that can be grown and are thornless, and then these are some of the primocane fruiting thornless varieties here, whereas these are just thornless raspberries. So trellising, this is definitely more important for blackberries, but can also be important for raspberries too, because these canes are kind of really, they're kind of like vines. They need to be held up. And so you want to build a trellis system. You can do it, you know, in a low cost budget way, like in this picture here, or you can build something a little bit more permanent out of wood. And there are a couple of different trellis systems that you can look up and see what works for you. But definitely plan on putting in that infrastructure. All right, so the last crop that I'll cover are strawberries. These are going to have a relatively high cost per acre because you have to buy so many plants, and the production system itself is going to be more similar to like a vegetable growing system. The two big types of strawberry varieties that you get are June bearing and ever bearing or day neutral strawberries. And what you need to know is that June bearing strawberries are only going to produce fruit in the spring, true to their name, whereas the ever bearing type of strawberries are considered like indeterminate, so they produce fruit all summer long. They'll keep making flowers instead of making runners. And runners are the offshoots that the strawberries will send out. So because they fruit all summer long, these can be a good choice if you want to have a U-pick. However, strawberry fruit quality tends to go down in the summer if it's very hot. So in regions like, well, really like here on the lower eastern shore, I tend to recommend the June bearing varieties over ever bearing because our summers are so hot here. We have so many days above 90 degrees, and that's really not good for their fruit quality. The other two type of kind of production systems that people use are plastic culture and matted rows. So plastic culture is what you see in most vegetable growing systems where you lay plastic and then plant directly into the plastic. This helps suppress weeds. Whereas matted row, you plant the strawberries directly in the ground and then you may use something like straw as a ground cover, or you just let the strawberries totally grow, you know, wild, and these are planted very far apart, but they can really get into the aisles, you know, because they will produce all of these daughter plants. And what I'm talking about when I say these daughter plants, so a strawberry will put off a runner, like a viney shoot, and then produce a secondary plantlet. And so in a matted row system, after the first year, we're utilizing some of these daughter plants to produce fruit. So in a June bearing, with the June bearing varieties of strawberries, they're only going to be producing fruit for 3 to 4 weeks. The fruit tends to be a little bit larger than the ever-bearing systems, and some of the cultivars we recommend for this region are listed here. Whereas for the ever-bearing and day-neutral strawberries, I think, like I said before, you're going to have fruit all summer, but they're not going to produce as many runners or daughter plants, and they don't do very well when the temperatures get very hot. And these are some of the cultivars that we recommend for this region. And again, you'll be able to get these when Shannon sends out the slides. Okay, so I guess in summary, there are plenty of types of fruit that you can grow in the Mid-Atlantic, but the very first thing you want to do is sit down and make a plan, build a budget, figure out what type of fruit you want to grow, and really think about how long that's going to be in the ground, because fruit growing is a long-term investment. And then there's really a huge variety of different characteristics of perennial crops. And so you want to think about, you know, do you want to have fruit at this time of the year, or what types of markets do you want to sell at, and what kinds of fruits do they like, what are good variety choices, you know, what suits your farm lifestyle, because that's going to vary significantly between the different crops. So I do want to point out, I didn't really give you all that much management advice. If there was time for it, I would, but one thing you're going to want if you are planting berries is this commercial grower's guide. These types of guides include all different kinds of diseases, fertility management, how to space your crop. And so this is a free guide. You can download the full PDF, or you could order a copy of the book. It's called the Mid-Atlantic Berry Guide. So If you're thinking about blueberries, raspberries, blackberries, or strawberries, this is a good one. Or if you're thinking about tree fruits, you can use the Penn State Tree Fruit Production Guide, and this also can be ordered from Penn State. So these types of books are really include all of the details and the nitty gritty that you need to know if you're going to be a commercial grower. So, all right. So with that, if there are any questions or comments, I've got my name and my location up here, my email, and then my cell phone number if you want to give me a call. And then also this QR code here, this is a teaching evaluation. So because we are a taxpayer-funded institution, we require some feedback and evaluations of our teaching abilities to keep us funded. So I would really appreciate if you would fill this out for me. I'll hand it back over to you, Shannon.
Great, Haley. That was wonderful. Very informative. We have a couple questions in the Q&A. One is about early on in your presentation, you were talking about labor needs, and they were asking about COVID-19 making it particularly hard to find labor right now. So, any things that farms are doing to kind of help with that?
Well, a lot of farms really hurt last year on the labor side. And so one thing that a lot of farms were doing, they may have traditionally done a wholesale where you just have labor come in and pick all the fruit. So last year, when there were all these people stuck at home, a lot of them pivoted to a U-pick model, where they had, people come in, pick their own fruit so that they could kind of decrease their labor needs. Now, I get that that doesn't work for everybody. So with COVID, the H-2A visa program was very different last year and also this year. Most of the farms I talked to this year were able to get labor, but again, it's something to plan for. And if you're trying to get people to work for you locally, you've got to basically have to pay. You've got to pay competitive wages. So that's always a tough thing for fruit growers, is getting labor.
Great, thank you. All right. Also, I put some information. I put the Ag Teach Haley's link there for her workshop in the chat pod. So if anybody wants to click on that, they can go right there. There is another question about sulfur. So are there alternatives to inorganic sulfur pellets? So I guess these sulfur products.
Well, so there are types of fertilizer. I guess what I should understand is, are they concerned about because sulfur isn't an organic product, or just they don't want to be applying something stinky? I guess I can kind of go over both. So you don't have to use sulfur pellets. There are other ways to acidify the soil. If you use some of these amendments, these will also lower your soil pH. Pine needles tend to be really cheap. Peat moss is a little bit more pricey, but you can also use pine bark. And then you can use pH is just a little bit too high. Say it's like 5.5 instead of 5. You can use fertilizer, an ammonium sulfate, and that will also lower pH. So there are certain fertilizers you use for blueberries, and others that you don't use any of the nitrate fertilizers for blueberries. because they don't take that up very well. But all this stuff would be in the Mid-Atlantic Guide, or if you want to know more, I could have a private conversation because I could talk about this all day.
All right, we've got another one coming in. Somebody commented this was great, just the information needed as a beginner. So that's great to hear. What are your thoughts about using coffee grounds for blueberries, and how often should they be applied in the amount? They're primarily trying to reuse grounds.
So coffee grounds are, they're a nice organic amendment, but they're not actually going to lower the pH very much. Pine needles and pine bark and peat moss are more effective at that. Even though coffee is an acidic food, people tend to think that the coffee grounds will lower pH, but I've seen some research about this. It's not very effective at lowering pH. So you can just keep applying coffee grounds to kind of build your soil and add organic matter, but as far as acidifying the soil, it won't do a good job at that. But yeah, I think it's a good mulch. You can keep putting it on the blueberries.
Great. All right, other questions? Let's see. See something in the chat. All right, I'm not seeing any more questions, so just looking through here. I appreciate your presentation today, Haley. That was really wonderful, and definitely a great overview for those that were tuning in. We will be sending out the recording, and I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.